Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Overwatch Lately, where we talk about what's been going on in Overwatch lately. And today I've got a very special guest, a good friend of mine. We've got Mr. Blevins coming on the show. How's it going?
It's going great, man. How you doing?
I am doing absolutely amazing. Hey, and we're already doing better than our other show. We're still talking about this show. We haven't immediately gone into a tangent, but I guess that's what this is too.
Well, we were on the right track, and you brought up the fact that we were on track, which brought us off. Okay, you got this. You got it.
All right. Let's go ahead. And so just for a little bit of history, Bliv and I have worked a lot on some other stuff, and it's very cool because he's the one that's usually driving, and today I get to take the wheel, and ask him a bunch of questions about Overwatch and what's been going on in Overwatch lately. So let's go ahead and start with the biggest news. Hashtag shock the world, my friends, because San Francisco Shock absolutely demolished Vancouver. You were there. What was it like to be in the stadium in the Wells Fargo Center, especially after everyone kind of realized that this game might not be as hype as one might have expected?
Yeah, it was still great. I mean, you're still in a venue where there's thousands of people, tens of thousands. I don't know what the actual count was, but a lot of people in there. It really felt like it was kind of divided. It really seemed like there were more Shock fans around. It didn't hurt that myself and everyone that I went with were literally decked out in orange and gray. Like, we spray painted the beards. One of our friends actually painted his whole head orange. So we were definitely rooting for Shock. There's some people around, but it felt like Shock was really the fan favorite, not by much, but by a little bit. So every time the Shock were doing something well, which, as we'll talk about, was pretty much the entire time, the crowd was still going crazy. They did a really good job with the fan engagement and really kept the crowd hyped up like you would see at a normal traditional sporting event. And yeah, I mean, even though the games were it was a little bit lopsided, it was still pretty hype in the arena.
Well, I mean, Vikon Walled was an amazing show, I think, coming from the San Francisco Shock, and Choi Hyobin just in general, because his Sigma play was very, very pretty. Even though it was a team type of domination, he did end up winning MVP. Was that kind of expected coming from, watching in the stadium, watching his play? Did everyone kind of know that was going to happen?
No, I think if you would have asked me at pretty much any point in time during the match who the MVP should be, I personally would have said Smurf, but that was because he was just popping off at different times. But Choi did an amazing job. Sigma has shown to be just an absolutely pivotal part of this meta and of the team dynamic. He has such huge PogChamp plays with his ults, and he does so much that it's not a surprise. The only surprise to me, though, was that it wasn't Sinatraa, because he's been, it seems Sinatra's done very, very well, and he was a pivotal part of the Shock's success this year. But it almost seems like he was like the write-in. Like, it was like, oh, it's WWE, the guy that always walks in second loses. It's going to be Sinatraa. He's the golden boy, not actual golden boy. He's the golden boy of the league. He's the poster child. So it was really nice to see Choi. And one other thing, my co-host for the Overwatch podcast I do has been calling Choi an MVP candidate since before the league started, before season 2 started. He has been all in on Choi, so I got to give massive credit to Deathblow, because he has been a Choi supporter from the very beginning.
Well, DB's a smart guy. We all know that. We all love that man as well. But let's talk a little bit more about the game. So we keep kind of referencing that it was one-sided. In your opinion, what made it so one-sided? We talked about Choi winning MVP, and it might be a team thing, and there's that wonderful Bastion play that we'll see a little bit later. But in your opinion, why was Shock so dominant? If you can say, oh, these 3 things are the reason why Vancouver just keeled over, what would they be?
Well, it was the first thing was early momentum. Shock, I mean, from the announcement of the players, when the players were walking out, I was worried for Shock because, Super came out. Obviously, he didn't play, but he's the hometown guy. Got a big cheer. Everyone came out, and for the Shock, they were almost a little like nervous, and almost felt like it seemed visually that they were like, holy crap, this is much bigger than the Blizzard Arena. I was not ready for this. And like they kept their composure, but there were multiple times where I saw Sinatraa like literally shaking his hands out like from the nerves, because I can only imagine what it's like being in front of that many people and walking out for the first time. Like, you can do rehearsals and whatnot and see the stage. Oh, okay, all the lights are on. Yeah, this is nothing. But then when the lights are off and the lights are all on you and you see tens of thousands of people, that's just like, it overcame him. And I was worried that if Vancouver came out early, that they weren't going to be able to, that the Shock were going to crumble, because Vancouver came out and they were cool as a cucumber. They all had little dances and whatnot and everything. It was really funny to see, but it didn't matter because Shock, right off the bat, I believe it was the first team fight of the entire match. Shock wins, and I believe it was on Li Jiang, and they won the first team fight, and it almost like seemed like all of those nerves went away. So Shock really had the composure there to get back in their game set. And the other thing that was really important for Shock and a detriment to Vancouver was that Shock was able to adapt and actually play their game and adapt to what Vancouver was doing. Vancouver, as you can see, I talked with a lot of people after the match, a lot of analysts and content creators around the Overwatch League, and we were saying Vancouver were just running set plays over and over and over again, and there was no dynamic, there was no back play there. Vancouver was just running their set plays and trying to play them better, which has worked for them the rest of the season. When you're that much better than player, you don't need to change it up. But Shock was able to adapt to that, and we saw, the Bastion comps, like you mentioned, were just so strong, and Vancouver really did not have any sort of real answer. And when they did, Shock was able to adapt where Vancouver wasn't.
Well, and another interesting thing about Vancouver is usually I feel like when an all-Korean team makes any kind of final, right, the special magic seems to take over, and then they're able to clutch it out so many times. And this time around, the Vancouver wasn't able to do that, right? It's just when you have set plays like that and you try to out-mechanic your opponents and you're unable to do it, then you're just stuck forever, right? Mm-hmm. There is going to be no adjustment because you never practiced those adjustments. So Did you see just them kind of deflate throughout the series? Because we've seen Vancouver bring back fights from the brink over and over again against the Shock even, but this time around that magic just was not there. And I know a lot of people were saying, hey, if Shock win control, Shock are going to win this whole thing, and Shock ended up winning control. But when you put all that together, what made Vancouver's performance so poor outside of just having those set plays? Let's dive a little deeper.
Yeah, it didn't even seem as much like Vancouver was playing super bad, because they had points in the match where, they looked like they were coming back. Like you said, Vikon Walled was a really good match because of a clip that we'll talk about in a bit. But also just like there was some back and forth there, but it seemed like those moments where we've seen in the past, Vancouver will take it over and then just crush the rest of the way. Shock was like, no, they just kept going, and Shock was able to adapt. Shock was able to keep their foot on the neck of Vancouver, to put it to put it bluntly. They really weren't backing down, and just Shock having so many players. Like, obviously Choi was MVP. I mentioned Smurf before. There's so many times where Sinatra would be Doomfist. He would either if he got a first pick, great. Shock just wins that team fight and goes on and crushes that map. If they didn't, we a lot of the time see Smurf come back and get one or two kills to bring them back in the fight. Maybe, they get back and stabilize, and then Sinatra comes back and they end up winning the fight there. It's just, so many of their players were able to step up and actually be performers, where, you don't get that with a lot of teams in Overwatch League, because they have a star player or two, and if you can shut them down, the rest of the team just kind of crumbles behind them. But Shock seemed more like a cohesive unit, where almost any player. I mean, we saw Rascal at times was popping off on the Pharah. I mean, there were times like, who do you focus on? You try to shut down Sinatra, Choi comes in, Rascal comes in. You don't even know. How do you stop a team where you've got 5 or 6 even different players who can all bring the team back from the brink?
Well, I mean, they just put the pedal to the metal, right? Like you said, They didn't take their foot off of their necks, and they just suffocated Vancouver that entire time. And it was funny because I was talking to Volamel last week about all of this, and we were like, the 2 best teams made it into the final. The meta is, friendlier towards one of these teams, and that would have been at the Shock. But in the end, the two best teams might have faced each other, but one definitely came out on top. So let's talk about specific highlights now. We've been bringing up that Bastion play. I think that's going to be in every Overwatch League package from here on out and for the next 10 years until Sugar Free becomes available for Overwatch League. He's 14 years old. And so now that we've got the Bastion clip going, he goes onto the chandelier. He absolutely rains hell from above. This was definitely my highlight of the entire finals. What about you, man? Where does this rank?
Oh, I mean, this is a probably top 5 all-time clip. Just regardless of Overwatch League, regardless of anything, like this was just such an amazing clip. I mean, like I said, this Vikon Walled match was actually pretty close, like in the match. Like Vancouver had held them a couple times on their pushes, and I believe, if I recall correctly, they both completed once, and then on the way back, or on the second go through, Shock ended up winning there. But there were times where at the beginning it actually looked like Shock was going to win super easily. Then Vancouver actually takes point 1 and point 2, or and takes the rest of the map actually pretty quickly as well. It's like, okay, we might have a match going on here. All right. And then we see this chandelier clip, and it's like, okay, Shock is just like, there's no set play that has the Bastion up on the chandelier. Let me tell you, because if there is, I want to be running that. But it just, like, that, even though it's like it's a crazy PogChamp clip and whatever, maybe it wasn't the best thing to do. I don't know. In my mind it is, but I'm also not the best at the game. But that play encapsulates to me what really put Shock way above Vancouver in these finals.
Well, outside of that, I think another really crazy thing that happened was in extra innings on Vikon Walled. There was a point where Choi Hyobin sucked up an entire Death Blossom, and then there was that Pharah change going into that last point. That was actually pretty awesome. I feel like he won MVP at that time because that was, I think, the closest that Shock came to potentially losing a map. That Vikon Walled was definitely the highlight of the whole series. But outside of Vikon Walled, was there anything else that you wanted to point out?
I mean, I really, really wish that there was, because it would have just, I mean, there was just so much that, I mean, looking back on it, yes, I was there in the arena and it was fine. Like it felt better than, just watching a random traditional sports game, where a team's getting blown out. 'Cause in those scenarios, the stadium starts getting emptied, and it really sucks the life out of it. They did a really good job the staff did a really good job of keeping the energy up, even when the games would not make you want to do that. But in terms of specific plays, I mean, I'm really grasping at straws. The rest of the maps were just so lopsided that I got nothing.
I mean, that's a A-OK answer, my friend, and that's a good summary of what we saw during the finals. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about, and this is just more generalized, is how you felt about the meta going into this, because I feel like a lot of people it's kind of polarizing here. If you know a lot about Overwatch, you know how it works, I think this meta was pretty fun to watch. But if you were kind of newer to the game, it might have been a little bit more difficult if you were just tuning in for the finals. Where do you kind of stand on how you felt the meta either helped or hurt the game overall during the playoffs and eventually the grand finals?
Well, whenever I look at comments on metas, I just imagine that comic book guy from The Simpsons is typing it on Reddit. Just worst meta ever.
What a great strategy.
I just imagine it's literally him every time, like typing on the keyboard, the worst meta ever. But no, I like this meta a lot. I mean, any meta where we get to see Doomfist is really good to me. I mean, we saw variety. I mean, we saw Bastion, we saw Doomfist, we saw Pharah at points, we see May Reaper. I mean, yes, we saw a lot of barriers or whatever, but honestly, like, people have very, very short memories when it comes to metas. And we hate dive. There's not enough shields. We need to stop. It's like, okay, well, we'll give you that. Oh, goats. How can you like goats? There's no DPS play. How can you do? Okay, well, we'll give you something else. Oh, shields. It's nothing but shields. I hate that. I don't want shields. Like, what do you want? Please just you know what, write out the 6 characters that exactly that you want, and we'll just make that game for you. Everyone complains about every meta. Let me tell you, back in the day, it was, oh, I can't believe that, you know, Farrah Mercy and McCree is in every single. Okay, yeah, well, the Reinhardt. The only tank you can use is Reinhardt. Yeah, way back in the day, people were still complaining about metas, and I have, you know, there's some metas that I like more than others. I think this one's definitely in my top half. I think the Doomfist play, really what makes a meta fun for me to watch, as a general analyst of the game and not a specific analyst of play. I like, and as more of a fan, I like the individual plays that people can make. You know, we see Doomfist making absolutely fantastic individual plays, which is why I think Sinatra was such a, you know, lifted up that on such a pedestal in a lot of cases. I mean, even the Sigma being able to make plays and counterplay too. Sigma being able to, we see a Doomfist coming in. Okay, well, I'm going to lob a rock at him, stun him for a second. My team's going to kill him. Having that type of play is really fun for me to watch, and I like that type of play. I fortunately don't have to worry about what's fun and easy to cast because I'm not a caster like you are, Boop. So whether it's easy to cast or not is irrelevant to me. As long as the professionals can do it, I'm good. But this meta, I think, is definitely a top one for me. I mean, I like to dive. I didn't mind goats as much as many people lamented goats. I thought goats was fine to watch. May Reaper's a really fun one for me too. So I think it was okay going into this.
All right, so for you personally, but you are very, I would say you're pretty knowledgeable about Overwatch in general. And so do you think that it's just hard to balance the game in a sense of how do you develop new viewers, right? Because if you started watching during this meta, it might be a little bit harder to kind of latch on, right? Based off of what you're seeing. Do you agree with that? Or do you think it's just kind of like, if you like Overwatch, you're going to like Overwatch regardless of what the meta is?
I tend to think that the latter statement that you made, but I think that has to be the case, because if it's not, then Overwatch needs to index very heavily on like Widowmaker play, because I think that if you're trying to get new viewers who've never watched Overwatch and that you want to make people understand something, there's nothing easier to understand than point and click the head of the opponent and they die and you start winning. I don't think that Overwatch wants to be that game. You know, Call of Duty, CS:GO, those are those games, or that is those games. You can understand exactly what's going on in a CS:GO match. Now, there's a ton of strategy that I'm not even personally familiar with. I watch CS:GO from time to time, but I know there's so much other strategy and team building. All that stuff is in CS:GO. Don't get me wrong, but at its core, click the enemy. They die, you win. That is the core of a first-person shooter, especially like Call of Duty or CS:GO. But Overwatch is not trying to be and has never tried to be that. So I think what people want, or what they think they want, is Widowmaker only, like Widowmaker 1v1 duels. Like that's what they want. But that's not Overwatch to me. That's an aspect of Overwatch, and can the league or Overwatch itself do something better to make it a better experience? Maybe. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I don't think it's indexing entirely on that like very core level, like headshot, kill the other team, win type of gameplay.
Well, last question before we move on to some of the roster changes, because you kept saying that's not Overwatch to me. What is Overwatch to you? Because when we were talking to, again, Volamel elaborated a lot last week and really piqued my interest in. I know the dude is smart, man. But
very,
you know, when he was talking about it, he was like, he doesn't think Overwatch has an identity right now, right? It doesn't know what it wants to be, and that's part of the problem. Where do you fall on that? Because you did mention that's not what Overwatch is to me. What is it to you? And is that what you think it should be, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a multi-million-dollar question to answer, honestly. What is Overwatch to me? I mean, it's, at the end of the day, it's a first-person it's a strategy game that requires personal mechanical skill through the medium of first-person shooter, but obviously within that, there's you need to like Overwatch's identity comes from the adaptability and variety in the game, right? I think having whenever I'm talking to people who don't know what Overwatch is, I'm like, oh, it's a first-person shooter. Oh, like Call of Duty? I'm like, well, it's kind of like Call of Duty, except you're trying to do an objective and not just kill your opponent. And also, you can be a giant space monkey with a lightning gun. And I think at its core, that's kind of what Overwatch is. Like, if you like first-person shooters, but you also want to fly around and shoot rockets at people, that's Overwatch. Now, obviously, there's the team aspect and all the strategy, but at its core, it's like you're using the mechanism of a first-person shooter to be able to have this huge variety of a game that's more so than you would see in CS:GO or Call of Duty or any of those other first-person shooters. You are not limited by the weapons. People are also like, oh, it's just like a game like that, but you can you get a bunch of different weapons. Like, kind of, but it's so much more than that. It's so much more than just different weapons. I think at its core, it's the possibilities and the adaptability that can be provided in any given game of Overwatch that really kind of, at least in some ways, starts to scratch at its identity. But if I had that answer, I'd probably be either assassinated by the Overwatch League or employed by them, and I'm not sure which.
Adaptability and possibilities. I like it, man. Put that on like a live, love, learn poster.
Adaptabilities. There we go.
Yeah. But all right, so that's it. That's gonna be it for what we're talking about for finals. It was 4-0 once again for the San Francisco Shock, who are the Season 2 Overwatch League Grand Champions. Congratulations to everyone involved there. But now it's some bad news for some of these teams, players, and coaches, because now is the time for roster moves. This is one of my favorite parts of the season, and the reason why is like when it's NFL offseason or like right before the draft, and where people are getting like right before the trade deadline, like that is where I feel like a lot of storylines start for the next season, right? And I think that that's what this is for a lot of these teams. But let's go ahead and start with Washington, who literally cleaned house. And so let's talk less about who they let go and talk about why they let go, because they were arguably the second, maybe the best team in stage 4. And I feel like in Overwatch, there have been a couple examples of people who've performed well, but then still get let go. I think the number one example I have is the Mayhem Academy squad from Contenders, where they beat, Fusion University. They were first place in their group, and it was like all of a sudden the next season they weren't there anymore, right? They did everything correctly and then were let go. And this seems to me to be kind of similar to that, even though the first part of the season was not stellar from them, and they were one of the worst teams. The adjustments were made, and you have to credit some of the coaching staff for that. Was it just too little too late, or was it something that they probably had planned for a while?
Well, I don't know the specifics of the deals, but if we assume a couple of things, if we assume that this is not the first thing we have to assume is that this is not their choice, right? Like Wizard Young and the other coaching staff, maybe they didn't want to be in Washington. I don't care. I mean, at the end of the day, like, yes, one stage of improvement is great, but when I don't remember exactly when Wizard Young and that staff came on, but like there was other times that they could have improved, and one stage of improvement, I think you put it perfectly. It's too little, too late for them. I also think that a lot of these orgs are thinking more big picture. Obviously, they have to with Overwatch League 2020 and the homestands, especially Washington with the 5 homestands or whatever. They are thinking more than just in the game of Overwatch itself. And now I don't know anything. I mean, I know a little bit about Wizard because he was with NYXL, but if there's any, the coaching staff needs to be aligned with the team and be making good team decisions inside the game of Overwatch. But I think also the coach needs to buy into the organization at a higher level. And again, I don't know anything specifically about these coaches or their deals with the org, but if there's any sort of, I mean, if I'm a GM or a front office staffer of Washington Justice, like going into this season, everyone needs to be on the same page. And even if I have to get brand new coaches or coaches who aren't as proven as some of these, like that's fine. Everyone needs to be bought into the system at this point. And because we're making big strides, not just in the game of Overwatch, but also the structure of 2020.
Well, let me tell you a little story because it kind of reminds me of this. So when I was a sophomore in high school, I failed chemistry, and I had 3 straight semesters of D or below, right? And then the very last semester, I got an A, but like the average was still I failed, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's kind of the same thing, right? Even just the 4 quarters, right? It's you can get an A on the last quarter, but when you compare it against the whole season, you just got some recency bias. But what you're speaking of is more about the buy-in aspect of it, right? But to me, I feel like it kind of just feels like a lot of these teams that have had these same coaching staff since the first season. I know Avala's been a part of it for a while. MKL was a part of it for a while. Their contracts probably just expired after the second season, and they get to decide whether they can go move on or go do something else or stick with the team. But when you're talking about buy-in, it's hard to say that these players or teams or these coaches don't necessarily have that buy-in, but you got to kind of think about it that way, right? It's like, do they even want to be in Washington? Right. Do they see success for themselves moving forward? So basically, I like what you're saying because it's not just the team necessarily saying, all right, you guys are fired. There's a little bit of personal responsibility there that I think is important to note.
Yeah. And I mean, we have talked about this on High Noon for years now, literally, about how a team will tweet out, oh, best of wishes to so-and-so. It's like, okay, did they leave on their own accord? Were they let go? Were they released? Were they fired? Did their contract? Like, we have no transparency in that. And like, I guess the teams, like, unless they're forced to, they're not going to. They're going to cover themselves as much as they can. But like, I don't know, we don't know. So I just got to assume or speculate based on different assumptions.
Would you like more transparency? Do you think we need that as fans?
Need is a strong word. I think some things we do need, or at least if we're looking at the ecosystem of traditional sports, and a lot of what Overwatch League is doing is within the realm of trying to emulate the ecosystem of traditional sports. There's some things that we want. There's some things that, I mean, as a fan, if I'm a diehard fan, not a content creator, if I'm a diehard fan of the Washington Justice, for instance, and I bought in, let's just extrapolate out a couple of years. I bought in, I've gone to all the home games, I've been diehard, I've spent hundreds of dollars on merch, all this stuff. Like, I'm a bought in fan of the Washington Justice. I want to know when my head coach is let go, did we fire them? Someone has to be held accountable for that. And I think that's literally owed to the fans in some capacity. And I think we're getting there to some part. There's been some reports, or at least some rumors out there, that we're going to be getting some contract information. I don't know if it's leaked or if it's going to be officially released, but we know all of that for, look at basketball, or you can Google the salary of any player in any major sport right now and know, okay, LeBron is making this much, blah, 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 making this percentage of the salary cap in football or whatever. And like, the fans, like, obviously they don't make decisions for the team, but like, the fans' perception matters to these teams. If the front office keeps making bonehead decisions and they're investing in these players that the fans don't like, or the fans will vote, essentially make the decision with their dollar. Oh, well, they cut my favorite player and they keep losing. I'm not going to go to the games anymore. I'm not going to buy any merch. And like, one person may not affect them, but when that happens in waves and they're making very unpopular decisions, I think that, just even if the fans aren't owed that, the teams are going to want to appease the fans in some ways.
Well, all right, man. So next up, we're going to talk about London. That was, I think, announced late last night or early this morning, where they're releasing 4. I think some recognizable names are a part of this. You've got JField even, but a big one is Birdring, who and Nuss, who were part of that, season 1 grand champion team. Both of those players not really performing as well this season. And there's rumors that Birdring's probably just going to retire as he's lost a little bit of passion for the game. And that's another story that we can, belabor on about for a while. But in terms of this kind of move, is it right? Is it wrong?
Well, I think it depends on what perspective. Are you talking about from the teams? Is it right for the team? Is it right for the players? Obviously, the players have to make their own decisions. If a player doesn't want to play Overwatch League anymore, they don't have to, and it's their right decision. As we are seeing it play out now, a lot of these year one players, the 2-year contracts are running out very soon. That's why we're going to start seeing a lot of these players up in free agency. I mean, we saw Arc actually, tweeted out that he's looking for team, and then had a clarification tweet like, "Oh, I'm not necessarily leaving, or going back to Washington is still an option. I'm just my contract. I'm a free agent now. I don't have to go back to Washington." And I think that's what we're seeing a lot here. London didn't take the immediate renewal. Some of these players, like you mentioned, Birdring might not want to play again, which I could understand. Birdring was definitely a top performer in season 1, didn't quite live up to it in season 2. And, not everyone wants to be, on the team watching their teammates perform and be on stage and do well when you're just not there. Obviously I would love to have that sweet Overwatch League salary to not play, but not everyone is a degenerate like me. Some people actually want to play and earn their keep. And I can see it. I mean, I can only imagine, even with the changes that happened in season 2, that the player burnout is still there. I think people just got used to it in season 2, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a number of these players, take the step down.
Yep, Arc. I think Sleepy's another one that was in a similar situation as Arc. So we're probably going to see a ton of movement in the coming weeks. I'm really excited for that. But it's not just the players. The coaches are going through a lot of changes too. So our friends over at over.gg have like a real-time team movement tool that you can kind of see where everyone is going, what's been happening for every single one of these teams. But let's talk a little bit more about the coaches. There's been changes for Gladiators, for Houston. In your opinion, why are so many coaches getting affected at this point? Because there's two kind of schools of thought, right? There's the Browns in the NFL, right? There's like let's tank for a high draft pick. There's no draft here. I mean, the Gauntlet's the closest thing that I think we have to a combine, but we can tank and build over a couple years. And then there's the other side of things. It's like, we don't get immediate success, you're gone, right? And it seems to matter for some of these teams, like we need success now, or some of the other teams are willing to grow. Are any of these coaching moves interesting to you? Do you disagree with any of them, or are all of these kind of par for the course and you're like, all right, I see where these orgs are coming from?
The only one that was a real shocker to me, and this happened actually earlier in the season, was Bishop for the Toronto Defiant. And it was a personal shocker for me because I've known Bishop for a long time. Actually had him on the podcast a long time ago, actually right before Overwatch League season 1. And I've met him up in Toronto for some of the Defiant events as well. And I have full disclosure, I have a bit of a connection with Toronto, not anything official, but I go to a lot of events. I know a lot of people up there. So just in talking with people, just casually, I didn't see anything really wrong going on there. And obviously Toronto did not live up to, their stage 1 performance, making the stage playoffs in stage 1, and then really kind of flopping the rest of the season. So at the end of the day, the blame, again, this kind of goes back to the fan accountability thing. The blame has to go on someone, right? We've seen a lot of player moves for Toronto, and I think that they've made progress there, at least in some ways. But like, when something like that happens, you generally want to clean house in some capacity in traditional sports. So am I going to cut my players and remake my team? Am I going to cut my coaching staff and have them remake the team? I think, or at least improve upon the team. I think that both of those things are probably going to end up happening for a lot of these teams where, hey, we didn't have the season we wanted to. At some point, it's like, it's not just player skill, right? Like I think a lot of these teams have very high mechanically skilled players. We need everyone to be bought in again to the process and to the program of the team. We need a strong coach that can come in and really dictate and take the responsibility of the team, because at the end of the day, the coach isn't out there playing, but it is their responsibility to get the players ready and to have them prepared and all that stuff. That all falls on the coach, at least in my opinion. It is I guess a contested opinion potentially, but it is in the coach's hands. And I think we're going to see a lot of these coaches come out, and then that's when we're going to start seeing them bring in players, because those two things need to be in tandem. You want the players and the coaches to be aligned. So you generally want the players, or I guess the GM as well, to bring in the new players for these teams.
Yeah, and a lot of people forget that a lot of these these are kids, right? 18 years old, or 18 to 22 really, and the coach has a hand in developing them as human beings as well, just like Mike Krzyzewski at Duke would do for his players on the basketball team. That they need to start, I think, doing a little bit more guidance that way too. I'm really excited for the potential of press training and how to talk online and social media stuff. That's all part of what the org, I think, should provide their players, along with physical therapy, sports psychology, all of that stuff. I hope eventually gets ingrained into these orgs when they eventually do grow. But you were talking about the Defiant, and the Defiant were able to grab some players from Contenders, and Contenders has a really awesome event starting next week, and something that we call the Gauntlet. And basically all the regions in the world and Tier 2 Overwatch are sending hopefully their best representative to try to see who is the best Tier 2 team in all of Overwatch. This is going to take place in South Korea in the Giga Arena, where I believe OGN takes place. So a lot of them have already gotten there. The toilets seem to be a very popular topic of conversation. We'll touch on that in just a second. But for you, what are you excited to see for the Gauntlet? Because for me, it's going to be like the NFL Combine, right? Scouts are going to be there. This is the best opportunity for these players, particularly those from regions that might not get as much attention, like China or some of the lower tiered teams in North America, to potentially get scouted out and join Overwatch League teams. Is there anyone that you are particularly excited to see? Is there something that you are really excited to see personally outside of the players when we do get to the Gauntlet next week?
Yeah, I think for me, as someone who focuses almost exclusively on Overwatch League, this is the type of Tier 2 event that I am actually pretty excited about. I want to see who are the up-and-comers, because I think this Season 3 for Overwatch League is going to be, it's almost going to be like the first real season. I think it was almost like these were the first two seasons, these are the beta seasons. We kind of got that. We're going into launch here. It's almost how it feels like, in the same way that Overwatch was in beta for a long time and then launched. Not really that much changed. It was just kind of like polished up a little bit. But I think now we need to start building those traditions, right? We need to start building that infrastructure for how a preseason works, how postseason, how a season works. And I think that sort of Gauntlet and the Gauntlet and, like you said, the Combine for the NFL, that's going to be part of it. So I want to see the new talent. I mean, we look at, these first 2 years, we technically had a Rookie of the Year this year, but did it really feel like a rookie? Not really. Now I think in Season 3, we're going to start feeling like, okay, these Contenders players coming up and playing for a team in Overwatch League, it's going to feel like coming from something that was very different and actually coming into the majors now. I think before it was really kind of a brackish almost of everyone's kind of at the same level and been playing basically the same level. Some of these teams have had an extra year, but as we saw with Runaway coming into Vancouver, yeah, they were. I mean, despite the meme, they were an Overwatch League level team, right? Obviously, they came in and did very well. Now it almost seems like, now maybe there's some of that, but it seems like a very distinct. This is Tier 2. You're doing this Combine, and now Tier 1 is a very distinct thing, and you're coming into that. And I want to see we look at the NBA now, like Zion Williamson from Duke. Actually, it's exciting to watch him and what he's been doing, because you can tell he's going to make a big impact. And seeing that for Overwatch is going to be exciting for me, especially in this off season.
Well, I hope that Overwatch League teams do a little bit more in terms of player development, because I think the difference between season 1 and 2 versus the next season is exactly what you're saying. There's a lot more of a separation, in my opinion, between Contenders and Overwatch League. We started seeing that a little bit this season, but there are some diamonds in the rough like Gator for Atlanta Reign, but the Contenders players like Gods for the Defiant, struggled quite a bit when they first got there. And so I think the big difference between like season 1 is you had established stars already. You knew these people were good. Now the next step in this equation is to see how you can develop players to become those stars rather than just being able to buy them out, because it's going to have to happen a lot more frequently, because you're no longer just going to be able to they're on Runaway. Let's just buy Runaway, right? And make them a team. That's going to be so much harder to do now that the pool is just a little bit smaller. But at the same time, if you're a player in tier 3 right now and you're trying to work your way up, you got to get to a Contenders team. And hopefully these orgs, like the Atlanta Reign, do a little bit more in terms of investment when it comes to Contenders and Academy teams. Is that where you want to see it going as well, that player development route? Because only a couple teams, I think, are doing a stellar job at it right now.
I mean, ideally, I'd like it to be like that. I'd like it to be how we see, the NBA G League or minor league baseball, where these players they can be kind of fluid between the two. We see them play. They're playing at a high level there in the minors, and then they come up. They get pulled up to the majors. The problem is, I don't know if there's the infrastructure or if there's the desire for these orgs or for Blizzard to want to. Like they need to be able to put forth the support for that, right? Like you need to be able to have these Contenders players making an actual wage, and not just scrounging about for it. You need to have these academy players really being part of the organization, just not at the same level as the tier 1 players. And I'd like to see that. I'd like to see a bigger focus on Contenders. I'd like to see more support for Contenders. I don't know if the organizations and Blizzard, just based on what they've shown so far, they're not looking to do that. But in an ideal world, we'd have, minor league or tier 2 Overwatch really be developed and really feel so much more like a feed in to Overwatch League, where now it's like, well, yeah, if the Boston Uprising see some player that's on whatever team, they'll just buy their contract or whatever. Like that's fine, or they'll just pick them up. It doesn't, that's fine. The academy teams. I mean, we've seen some players go from the academy team to the respective team, but we've seen them jump around, which is like, okay, that's fine. But like, why are you doing it then? I mean, New York and XL2 seem like the biggest like offenders of this. It's like they have their complete Korean roster, and then they changed their XL2 to be a like New York based player.
And then they ended up not doing that. Yeah.
Right. And it's like you're completely missing the mark trying to do that. And then like if they're turning Contenders into like a marketing ploy, like just shut it down, I guess. But I mean, I want to see a feeder league or a feeder, org into Overwatch League. I just hope that it gets standardized and supported properly.
Yeah, it feels kind of like a side note right now, rather than kind of something that's something rather than a cog in the actual machine,
yes.
Right? And it needs to feel like a cog in the machine, because I think that one of the biggest issues that I think a lot of the players in tier 2 feel is that it just feels so tier 2, right? You feel like you're second best. You don't feel valued, and we got to change that in terms of that scene. So hopefully the Gauntlet's the first step in doing that. I know that they have some really cool plans for Contenders going into next season. Well, hopefully, because they've had a lot of time to think about it. But going into next season, hopefully we get that kind of established feeder system into Overwatch League, because player development is going to become increasingly more popular. But to end this right now, we talked about Korea, and I'm Korean. I've spent some time in Korea myself, and for some reason, the first thing you do when you're in Korea, it's hard, is you go to the bathroom and you have to ask yourself, am I going to use this bidet? Because a lot of Contenders players right now are currently asking themselves, and their minds are blown of the technology involved in these toilets. Have you been lucky enough to experience the wonder of the bidet, Blevins?
I have not. It has been dark. It has been benight and not bidet in my world. Okay, I'll leave. I'll leave on my own accord. No, but that might be the worst joke I've ever made.
Yeah,
Period.
you should boo yourself. Yeah.
All right. I don't control the sound clips for this, but no, I have not partaken. I haven't even really had the opportunity to. But I certainly would if presented.
Everyone at home, that is the correct answer right there. But I like getting on a lighter note. So the next section is one of my favorites because we talk about Overwatch. We've been talking about Overwatch for 45 minutes already, and now we get to talk about something that's more about you and your personal passions.
Yay!
And so something that I respect about you is the fact that you are a multi-talented man, Mr. Blevins. Not only can you run a whole plethora of podcasts, right? You can grow an amazing beard. You can also do so many impressions. Like, this guy is so good at it. So I thought we'd take the next couple minutes and give us your 3 favorite impressions. Really impress us.
Oh man. Usually, hold on. I need to. There's one thing that you know about me that I need to do before I can do this. I gotta wet my mouth.
You gotta wet your mouth. Yep. You gotta take the smallest sip of water. Yep. You gotta wet the mouth.
I feel so refreshed after that. But usually, like, people, I'll do a voice just randomly. I usually don't, like, when people ask me, "Oh, do that voice," I'm just like, no. Mr. Blevins, not the voice now, no. And I mean the classic, you're doing the voices and you don't want to keep doing them, so you do like an over exaggerated walking voice to get people to stop asking you to do them. That usually works too. And then of course, I've got the puppet too, but you always got your Kermit the Frog impression ready to go at any point in time, and you're good. You're good to go.
So my question is like, I've tried impressions. If, like, I've talked to you about it before, my Australian accent is racist. And so how do you learn, how did you learn you had this skill? And do you sit at home practicing? Because in my opinion, it is a skill. On SNL, there's usually, a female and male performer that is their impressionist, right? Like the Daryl Hammonds, I think Melissa Villaseñor is their female impressionist right now. That's kind of like what they do. How did you learn about this talent?
Well, I don't want to put myself in the same echelon as a lot of the many, many talented voice actors out there. I don't consider myself a voice actor like a John DiMaggio or a Billy West or a Phil Lamar, who you probably might not recognize, but have just done 10 billion voices in various cartoons and movies across the years. Pretty much any animated thing you've seen in the last 20 years has one, if not all 3 of them in it. But for me, I grew up from a very young age watching The Simpsons. Just absolutely was my upbringing. What's The Simpsons? For better or for worse. And a lot of that is obviously that core group of actors doing a variety of different voices. And the classic monkey see, monkey do was just me going around doing different voice impressions of different Simpsons characters and whatnot. And I think you bring up SNL, and I think the first, I would do like different Simpsons characters and stuff for like kids in middle school, and they thought they were funny just because I was doing like a silly voice or whatever. But the one that really kind of cemented it for me of like, oh, people actually really like these impressions, and I'm better at them than most people around me, at least at the time, was actually from SNL. Will Ferrell's Harry Carey impression, the classic Cubs announcer. A friend of mine that played basketball was doing his impression of it, and people were just dying laughing, and I'm like, this isn't even good. It's like not even getting it right. So of course, the degenerate competitionist that I am, I just completely like just one-upped him in front of a bunch of people, and just like did my Harry Carey impression, and the rest is history. I just like kept doing it, and people liked it, and I don't know what happened to him, but he's not on a podcast right now talking about voice impressions. I'll give you that. I'll tell you that much.
Well, there you go. And so that's what I like to call That's Not Overwatch. Learned a little bit about you, but let's learn a little bit more about you, your professional world here in the Overwatch world, I guess. So you're pretty much, I think you're well known around the community at this point for High Noon Podcast. You've gotten some really good guests on there. You've gotten some Overwatch League talent on the show. Basically, it's kind of like around the horn type of thing. I've been lucky enough to win on the show, just to let everyone know. But I also am really good at giving other people points. It's a thing I need to stop doing.
That is true. You are good at setting people up to get points on the show.
Yeah, but anyway, like, how long have you been doing that aspect of this? Because you've been doing the High Noon Podcast as long as I've been a fan of Overwatch. Were you doing stuff beforehand, or was Overwatch kind of the first thing that you got started on in terms of your podcasting?
Yes, the podcast origin story. So way back in the day, probably 2011 or so, maybe even earlier than that. Sometime back then, I used to be a competitive Magic the Gathering player. So I live in Buffalo, New York, and I have a competitive edge from playing sports as a child. And since I didn't like doing that as much as an older child, I got into I always played Magic, and when I moved to Buffalo, I became part of that competitive community and really kind of shaped that. So we would travel the country, literally going to different events, usually 4 or 5 large, like myself, guys jam-packed in a car, and sleeping as many as we can fit on a floor to different events that are 8 to 10 hours away. And I would travel with the same group of people, or at least the same core of people most of the time. And me and my other friend, Joe, people would want to be in our cars after the time, because we would be talking the whole time. Most people just want to sleep, and we're talking, making jokes, just talking about Magic, talking about anything. And one day we literally were like, hey, next time we go to a tournament, we should just like record it. And do like a podcast. And it's like, well, why don't we just do a podcast normally? I'm like, oh, okay. So we started what I consider still the greatest podcast ever, the Slam Dunklers. That was a Buffalo Magic the Gathering specifically podcast. And it was one of the most fun podcasts I've ever done. I think in terms of its fan base, it had one of the most vehement fan bases of any podcast I've ever done. And it was the most genuine, I think, podcast I've ever done in terms of like, this is just something I want to do. I don't even need to record. We literally weren't recording for a lot of these, and it was very off the wall, so much about that. So I honestly don't even remember why we stopped doing that. I think we just had things come up in life, and we didn't have the same passion for it, so it kind of died off. We actually did some reboots a bunch of times and had some gags that were pretty funny with that. But enough about that story. So that was my first foray into podcasting, was that. And then I did when Hearthstone came out, I did a short run Hearthstone podcast, actually with Deathblow, my current High Noon Podcast co-host. We did a Unleash the podcast. Never really got any traction. We came from the Magic the Gathering background. When Hearthstone came out, it was a no-brainer that we wanted to do a podcast about it. Didn't really take off. But again, I didn't really care. We weren't doing it to make money or anything. Just did it for fun. And once it stopped being fun, we stopped doing it. Then BlizzCon 2015 comes around, and I'm going. I've never been to a BlizzCon before. I had kind of heard about this Overwatch thing. I'd looked up the trailer and whatnot. I had heard rumors about it, and saw some things. And I'm like, oh, this looks cool. And someone, I don't even remember, it wasn't Deathblow, someone else actually was like, hey, you should do a Overwatch podcast. I'm like, well, I know nothing about this game, and like I haven't played a first-person shooter since Gears of War 1, so I'm not really interested in doing that. Then I go to BlizzCon 2015, see the videos, go to the panels, all this stuff. I'm like, okay, I'm hooked. And I messaged DB and was like, hey, I don't know if you want to do another podcast, but I'm doing one on Overwatch, and if you want in, you're welcome. You're welcome to. And we're now coming up on 4 years. This BlizzCon will be 4 years of Onion Podcast.
I remember when they announced Overwatch Origins, and I bought Overwatch on the floor the second they announced it. It was just Overwatch just came in with so much hype too, right? And the trailers were so good, and the aesthetic of it was good, and Tracer was such like a good like person to hold the mantle to really advertise to a lot of people. She was so relatable, and basically it's just like a perfect main character. I remember them saying it. I was at a panel and they were like, we weren't gonna announce anything, but then we made Tracer and she was perfect for this. And so we decided to just run with it with Tracer. So we definitely have similar stories there. But something that I think is most impressive about anyone who creates content, but creates content consistently, because I've done a comedy channel, I've done information stuff, I've talked about contenders, but I've never been, as impressed with people as people who are able to produce content on a weekly basis, almost every single week, and grind. How do you do it, man? Because you also have another job that you're balancing this stuff with. You're on multiple podcasts. You have to do the research and do your regular job. That balance must be hard, but how do you continuously produce this content while also balancing that other aspects of your life?
Yeah, it's not the easiest thing to do, I must say. Part of it is that I have such a personal investment in the content that I'm doing, and I just like doing it so much, and I want to keep doing it. And I know if I stop doing it, I'm not going to do it if I don't do it, if that makes sense. It doesn't really make sense, but it's like you can't say that you've made content if you don't do it. So you just got to do it. And I think that's one of the hardest things to do, is to just start making the content and continually doing it. My job is very, luckily for me, quite flexible, so I can do things during the day sometimes, and I am, I guess, good at multitasking or bad at my job. I don't know. Where I just care so much about it that I sacrifice other things like sleep in order to do these shows. And actually, a really quick story, kind of about that really shaped my mindset about this is TwitchCon 2016. I went to a panel that featured Devin Nash, who, if you're unfamiliar, was the CEO of Counterlogic Gaming at the time. He'd worked with Dignitas as well. Now I think he works with I forget what company he works with, but he's a streamer now as well. But he did a panel about streaming and blah blah blah. I talked to them after the panel and asked him a question. I go, hey, so I have a full-time job, work 9 to 5. I've got a family of sorts. I have a girlfriend or whatever. And how do I go from doing that to, really pushing, my podcast and my content? And he goes, well, okay, you work from 9 to 5, right? I go, yep. He goes, well, what are you doing from 6 to 2? And like that question in and of itself really like impressed upon me there's more, like, your day is not 9 to 5, then go to sleep and wake up again. Because if it is, and for some people it is, and I don't want this to sound like I'm like crapping on people who do that. But for me, like, I need to do the other stuff, because if my job, at least my current job, becomes my life, that's not a good thing. I'll put it like, that's not what I want to do. That's not the life that I want to live. So I'm fortunate enough to have a support network of friends and family that support me. I'm not impoverished or anything, so I don't need to worry about being homeless, which I'm very fortunate to have. So I've got the ability to do these things, and I've been afforded the ability. So I try to not squander that when I can.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So you were talking about starting the podcast, but like when you're thinking about it, right? Basically, like the joke is, I remember making this joke a little while ago. It's like, is there a podcast about podcasts yet? Because I feel like a lot of times it's just like, why don't we start a podcast? It's something that people just throw out a lot, and it's a saturated market. There's a ton of them out there, whether it be about games or true crime, like Serial, but very few of them ever really make that upper echelon, right? So how do you do it in such a saturated market? I know the consistency is part of it and actually putting out content, but in terms of why, right? Knowing that the market is so saturated, like what is the why there for you? Where does the passion come from?
So it's really just a play to my strengths, right? So I'm not a videographer. I've been a streamer from time to time, but I think that the streaming, YouTube, video, podcast, it's all they're all mediums to a greater message of just the content in general, and they're just different platforms, right? So for me, podcasting is what I've done mostly because that's what I knew how to do. And the equipment, I honestly, I just bought the equipment for it before I bought like good video equipment. So like, and I do videos and whatnot, but it's just been the medium that I've used and has worked for me. And really, if one of the other ones took off, I would focus more in on that. But to answer the question specifically about why start a podcast in a saturated market is, I didn't view it when I'm starting a podcast. So when I started High Noon Podcast, for instance, there were podcasts out there, obviously, yes, but I'm not starting High Noon Podcast to compete with Mark Maron and Joe Rogan and those people, because like those people, I'm not going to be stealing viewer. Like we're not going for the same audience, right?
Yeah.
So when I started High Noon Podcast, there were, I think, 2, maybe 3 other Overwatch podcasts total, like about Overwatch in any capacity. There was Overwatchers, there was the Overview, and there were a couple of other ones as well. So what I did was we made the decision very early, I think maybe episode 2 or 3, maybe even before that. I don't remember, it was so long ago, where it's like, okay, we can try to compete with these guys, but like Overwatchers is Garrett Weinzierl and those guys that do a lot of those, the Angry Chicken and a lot of other really good Blizzard podcasts. Like, I'm not trying to, as a literal nobody, trying to compete against those people directly. So we made the decision very early on to be the esports focused or competitive focused. So there were a handful. There was, like 1 or 2 tournaments that were planned to happen. None had actually happened yet, but we were like, well, this game is going to be an esport. I think they may at this point have talked about them designing it for esports and for competition. So it's like, we're just going to cover that. Whatever it ends up being, we're going to cover that. And like, that market was not saturated for a very long time. We were the only competitive focused Overwatch podcast. I would argue until Overwatch League was announced, there were no other esports and competitive specifically focused Overwatch podcasts out there at all. With the Overview did focus heavily on it, but like there was not anything that was specifically about it. Like we would talk about characters and lore and stuff only as it pertained to the competitive scene. We weren't going into all the Overwatch stuff because there's other podcasts for that. So when I'm starting a new podcast, it's like, how can yes, there are a bajillion podcasts out there, but how can I find a niche and either how can I do something that's completely new and different? How can I do something that's different within the lens of something that's already being done? Or how can I or how is something being done that I can do better? And at this point in time, like I've been doing podcasting for a while, so Like, I now am not a literal nobody. I'm just mostly a nobody. But like, if someone's doing the only podcast about this, that, or the other thing, it's like, I think I can do a little bit of a better job, or I can do a comparable job and put my polish on it. I don't put polish on anything. I can put my spin on it. Then that's where I'm looking to actually do something new.
Well, thank you so much, man. That is all the time that we have today. So, like, you taught me this one. You gotta let the other person tell you, where do you find yourself online?
Oh man, you can find me at _Blevins on Twitter, and you can find all my Overwatch stuff. Just search for High Noon Podcast, basically anywhere, and it will pop up.
All right, man. Once again, thank you for coming on to the show, and thank you all for listening. And remember, that's been what's been happening in Overwatch lately. We'll see you next week.